Feminists use the same logic as racists. Now, obviously, I am not referring to all feminists because if I were, I'd have to also be referring to myself as I am a feminist. I support the liberation of all people, and that undoubtedly is going to include feminist theory. However, I think a lot of people who refer to themselves as feminists take on blatantly anti-men sentiments and beliefs without ever questioning them, and they exist in a space online where they're not really compelled to question them. Like, a lot of feminists today are in these kind of left-wing bubbles that, simply due to the fact that men have experienced privilege in a number of areas historically and for a very long time at that, they don't feel compelled to call out the ways that they are talking about men that actually serve to alienate a lot of men and are probably pretty unhealthy for these feminists themselves. Now, here's where we get into the comparison with racists, because if I were a racist, I would say something along the lines of, African Americans disproportionately commit more violent crime, and either I would say that statement by itself and just sort of leave you to guess what I'm implying. Usually without qualifying that statement, there's really only one way that can be taken. Or if I were a little bit bolder, I would go on to say, and this is why there's some inherent characteristic in those African Americans that cause them to commit more violent crime. Of course, this is nonsense. These racist views, this pseudoscience, this has been disproven time and time again, but it's essentializing race. It's saying that your race is tied to some essential characteristics that are inherent to your being and that's just how things are. I think gender essentialism, unfortunately, is invoked by a lot of feminists today, specifically in regards to men, even though historically, the point of feminism has been literally to deconstruct essentialistic conceptions of gender and to actively fight against them, to break down gender stereotypes and so forth. And a lot of these modern feminists seem less interested in doing that and more interested in attacking men in an essentialistic manner. Case in point being the fact that men disproportionately are credited with perpetuating violent sexual crimes. Now, it's true that women do this as well, and that this often goes unreported, which is a huge problem that men face. However, even if we were to account for those numbers that are not accounted for in the statistics that we have, it still would be a glaring difference. Like, it's objectively true that men perpetuate these crimes more often. But more often than not, I see feminists not qualifying those statements with any explanation as to why men are more likely to do that, or they just straight up say it's because men are evil and that we need to kill all men. And these people are being tolerated by many people on the left who do not believe that, simply because they're not intuitively offended by that assertion, by those notions, because they've enjoyed a position of privilege for a long time, causing them to not really be affected by that anti-men sentiment. They don't have personal trauma with women that causes them to have an intuitive response to that, and the hierarchical differences that would lead to that trauma response also aren't there. So they hear this and they disagree with it, but they don't question it. They don't go out there and talk about it like it's a real problem in the movement, when it is. Not just because this essentializes men and this pushes away many men from your movement who think you sound insane and don't think that they're rapists or capable of doing such a horrendous act. This also hurts the women who believe these things about men. Because, even if they're like radical lesbians or whatever, they're still going to interact with men. They're still, going to have at least acquaintances who are men. And if they're in the back of their mind seeing these people in this deeply unhealthy way, that because they're men, they're inherently predisposed to rape, and that this leads to them being bad people and so forth, that's like half of the population that they've just segmented off in their own brain and are now seeing and treating differently as a result of these unhealthy views. This is bad for the women who believe these things, much in the same way that unhealthy and essentialistic conceptions of women by people like incels and men's right, quote unquote men's rights activists and so forth, are very unhealthy for them as well. It's the same thing. It's gender essentialism. It's simply, coming from the other side, going in the other direction. And it's exactly the same thing as racism and racial prejudice, and they're employing similar tactics to those used by racists. But here's what I would say. If I were in the position of those feminists, I would say men disproportionately perpetuate sexual crimes of a violent nature. And here's why. And this is how I would qualify that statement. Historically, men have not been taught how to ask for consent, or even how to have conversations of an intimate kind. There's a lot of things that women are taught socially that men are not, and this creates a kind of autism in a lot of men that leads them to believe that what they're doing sexually is just okay, that they don't actually know that what they're doing lacks consent and is thereby, leading to this negative outcome. They simply haven't had these conversations or been told these things in the way that they need to hear it. At the same time, society actually discourages them from engaging in those conversations and learning to do these things, because it is tied to being more feminine, being less masculine, and could potentially be associated with some ostracization or internalized shame on their part. Um, and of course, at the same time, like the way that we treat men in society is just really, really not good. The fact that more often than not, men are forced to not have any emotions and to not display any emotions aside from anger. And take on much more difficult and much more dangerous jobs, thereby leading to a much higher suicide rate. The alienation and stratification of this group are it's huge and it's serious, and I think these are many of the factors that end up leading to rape culture. And if we could address the needs of this group, and address the disparities and problems in how they're parented, we could see that number of sexual assaults go way down. I also think a lack of education and economic hardship, alienation as a capitalist subject, are huge factors as well. And by creating a more egalitarian economy, especially one where, we all kind of have to work together and live together, this could also address some of those disparities. And I have data to back that up as well. For example, unionized households, people who have to be in unions, have been shown to be far less prejudiced against gay people, against the opposite sex, and against people of other races. And if you've ever been to a union meeting, it's going to become abundantly clear why, because you have to have unanimous consent, get everybody to agree on a decision for the union to make. And even if it isn't structured in that way, you're going to have very rigorous debate, and it's going to be quite arduous and intense. And when you have to get everybody on board in that manner, it's going to lead you to humanize a lot of your neighbors in a way that you might not necessarily prior to having been involved in that union. And so this is data that's been bared out. And so I think by socializing the workplace, by instituting a system of democracy in those workplaces, thereby removing a lot of the alienation that men experience, and also making it to where there's more economic security for those men as well, we're going to see some of those um, uh, negative views towards women go down. And having these conversations about consent and changing the way that we see our masculinity and the way that we see each other through education and through changing the culture surrounding the genders is going to be crucial as well. But this isn't something inherent to men. This is something that uh, is hurting men as much as it's hurting women. Like, patriarchy isn't bad because it's bad for women, it's bad because it affects all of us. I don't think anyone wants to be a rapist. I really don't. I think there are people who, for a complex set of reasons, become rapists. And those are people that need to be rehabilitated by the system. Those are also people that we can prevent from coming into existence in the first place by changing our society, changing our parents, and changing the mode of production. Um, and ultimately, this is why I believe we can't have the liberation of women without a broader economic liberation, taking the major modes of economic power and putting it in the hands of the people. But um, it's not, none of this is about um, something inherent to gender. This is all about how we respond to our environments and the societies that we live in. And that's how I would qualify that statement. Men commit disproportionately more sexual violence. I would explain why, from a psychological standpoint, from the standpoint of how the genders interrelate, and how our alienating economic system negatively impacts all of us, down to gender, race, and also class.